Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, and before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. In the heart of the unforgiving West, a shattered whisper holds a lifetime of shame. But when a hard-bitten rancher is faced with this confession and rips away the veil hiding a brutal past, his reaction will challenge everything about sin, survival, and the quiet strength found in the deepest scars. Chapter 1: The Weight of a Whisper. The sun was a merciless god in West Texas, beating down on the dust-choked plains with a fury that bleached the very soul of the land. It hammered on the warped shingles of the ranch house, a solitary sentinel in a sea of ochre and dying grama grass. Inside, there was a physical presence thick with the ghosts of unspoken words and the fine, gritty dust that seeped through every crack and crevice. It tasted of solitude and smelled of old wood, sweat, and something else, something akin to sorrow left to fester. This was Jake's world, a world carved from grit and silence, where a man's worth was measured by the calluses on his hands and the steel in his spine. His face was a roadmap of that life, etched with the deep lines of sun and worry. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. They had seen cattle die of thirst, then break under the strain of a failed season, and the hope in a woman's gaze curdle into despair. He was a man made of the same unforgiving earth. He worked hard and unyielding. And then, there was Anna. She had arrived like a tumbleweed blown in by a storm he hadn't seen coming, a specter of a woman seeking refuge. He'd found her near the dry creek bed, her horse lame and her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to swallow the vast emptiness of the landscape. He had offered the shelter of his home out of a sense of gruff duty, a relic of a code that even the harshest of frontiers couldn't entirely erase. She had been with him for 3 weeks, a silent, flitting presence in the corners of his life. She mended his shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, cooked meals that were nourishing but eaten in a silence that was heavier than any conversation, and moved with a haunted grace that made him feel like a bull in a china shop within the confines of his own home. She was a ghost at his table, a mystery wrapped in a worn calico dress. She never spoke of her past, and he, a man who valued privacy as much as water, never asked. Her eyes, deep pools of an indeterminate color that shifted from brown to green in the shifting light, held a universe of pain he didn't dare to breach. But it was the way she carried herself that truly unsettled him, a constant, coiled tension, as if she were perpetually braced for a blow. She kept a heavy woolen shawl draped over her head and shoulders, even in the stifling heat of the day, a barrier between herself and the world, between herself and him. The afternoon sun, a molten gold disk in the bleached sky, cast long shadows across the floor of the main room. The air was thick, promising a thunderstorm that might or might not come. It was a waiting kind of quiet, the kind that frayed the nerves. Jake sat at the rough-hewn table, cleaning his cold peacemaker, the familiar weight of it in his hands a small comfort. The rhythmic clicks and scrapes of metal on oiled cloth were the only sounds, a metronome counting down to a moment he didn't know was coming. Anna stood by the window, her back to him, a slender silhouette against the blinding glare. She had been still for a long time, staring out at the unforgiving landscape as if it held an answer she was desperately seeking. The dust motes danced in the shafts of light, illuminating the worn floorboards and the quiet desperation that clung to her like a second skin. When she finally spoke, her voice was a dry, rasping thing, a whisper that seemed to be torn from the very depths of her soul. It was so quiet he almost missed it, but in the oppressive silence of the room, it landed with the force of a physical blow. "I'm not pure." The words, spoken in English but carrying the weight of a confession from a forgotten language, hung in the air between them. They were a stark, brutal admission in a world that, for all its savagery, held a rigid, unspoken code of honor and propriety, especially for a woman. The click of the hammer on his Colt ceased. The room, which had been silent before, was now utterly still, a vacuum where sound and time had ceased to exist. Jake slowly, deliberately, placed the revolver on the table. He didn't look at her, not yet. He looked at the gun, its blued steel gleaming dully. Purity. It was a word that felt out of place here, in this land of dust and blood and survival. Here, you were alive or you were dead. You were strong or you were broken. Purity was a luxury for softer places, for women in lace who had never known the gnawing emptiness of hunger or the chilling touch of fear in the dead of night. He had seen what this land did to people. He had seen it strip them down to their barest essence, burning away everything that wasn't essential for survival. He had assumed Anna was a widow, or perhaps a woman fleeing a bad marriage, a common enough story. He had seen the weariness in her, the deep, bone-aching exhaustion of someone who had been running for a long time. But this was something different. This was a deeper wound, a stain on the soul that she believed defined her. Slowly, he turned his head, his gaze falling upon her rigid back. The shawl still covered her, a shroud of secrets. The confession, he realized, wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. It was a key, offered with a trembling hand, to a door he wasn't sure he was ready to open. He thought of the women he had known, the stoic, hard-working ranch wives, the saloon girls with their painted smiles and hard eyes. They all had their stories, their scars, visible or not. But Anna's words suggested something more, a violation that had carved itself into her identity. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a rope about to snap. He could feel her trembling from across the room, a fine, barely perceptible tremor that spoke of a monumental effort of will. She had offered up her deepest shame, and now she was waiting for the verdict. Waiting for the judgment, the disgust, the inevitable casting out. He knew it was what she expected. It was what the world had taught her to expect. He rose from his chair, his movements slow, deliberate. The scrape of the chair legs on the wooden floor was a deafening roar in the charged silence. He was a large man, and he was conscious of the way his size could intimidate, the way his shadow could swallow a room. He had lived his life among men and horses and cattle, and he knew more about branding irons and barbed wire than he did about the delicate, intricate workings of a woman's heart. Especially a heart as broken as the one he sensed was beating in the woman before him. He walked towards her, his boots falling softly on the dusty floorboards. He stopped a few feet behind her, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her body, close enough to see the frayed edges of her shawl. He didn't speak. Words were clumsy things, and he knew that any word he might offer now would be inadequate. Instead, he just stood there, a silent presence, letting her know she was not alone in the suffocating quiet. The sun was beginning to dip lower, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The light in the room softened, became more forgiving. He could see the fine hairs on her neck, just below the edge of the shawl. He saw the way her knuckles were white where she gripped her own arms, holding herself together as if she might shatter into 1,000 pieces. And in that moment, something shifted within him. The hardened shell of the pragmatic rancher, the man who saw the world in terms of profit and loss, of survival and defeat, cracked just a little. He was no longer just a man offering shelter to a stranger. He was a witness to a confession, a custodian of a terrible secret. He felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time, something that felt dangerously like compassion. It was an unfamiliar, unsettling emotion, and it demanded something of him. It demanded that he do more than just stand there. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a moment before he gently, tentatively, took hold of the edge of her shawl. She flinched, a sharp, violent jerk, and he froze, his hand still holding the rough-spun wool. He expected her to pull away, to run. But she didn't. She just stood there, her body rigid, her breathing shallow. It was a silent, terrifying consent, a plea. With a slowness that felt agonizing, he began to pull the shawl back. The fabric was heavy, and as it moved, it seemed to take the last of her defenses with it. The fading light caught the edge of something on her cheek, something that wasn't a shadow. It was a line, a silvered, puckered ridge that ran from her temple down to her jaw. The shawl fell away completely, pulling around her shoulders. And in the dying light of the West Texas sun, Jake saw the full extent of the story she had tried to hide. Her face, which he had only seen in glimpses, was a canvas of cruelty. A network of scars, old and new, crisscrossed her skin. The one he had seen first, was a thin, silvery line, almost delicate in its ugliness. But there were others. A raw, angry burn mark that puckered the skin on her other cheek. A jagged, star-shaped scar on her forehead, partially hidden by a stray lock of her dark hair. And her lip, he saw now, was split by a thin white line, a permanent reminder of a brutal impact. It was a face that told a story of unimaginable violence, of a past so brutal it had been permanently etched into her flesh. Each scar was a chapter, each line a testament to a pain he could barely comprehend. The word pure echoed in his mind, and it now sounded like a cruel, bitter joke. It wasn't about purity. It was about survival. His breath caught in his throat. He had seen men after bar fights, men gored by bulls, men who had been dragged by their horses. He had seen death and injury in all its gruesome forms. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was the work of a monster, a man who had taken a woman's face and had tried to erase her, to turn her into something ugly, something to be hidden away. He saw the shame in her eyes as she finally turned to face him. Her eyes, those beautiful, haunted eyes, were filled with a raw, pleading vulnerability. She was showing him the source of her shame, the reason for her whispered confession. She was showing him her brokenness, and she was waiting for him to turn away in disgust. But he didn't feel disgust. He felt a cold, hard knot of fury form in his gut. A rage so potent it was almost blinding. A rage directed at the unknown beast who had done this. And beneath the rage, there was something else. A profound, aching sorrow for the woman who stood before him, who had been forced to carry this burden, to hide her face from the world, to believe that these marks on her skin were a reflection of her worth. He had lived a life of solitude, a life of self-reliance. He had never considered himself a man who needed anyone. But in that moment, looking at Anna's scarred face, at the raw and filtered pain in her eyes, he knew that his solitude was over. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a protector. He was the only thing standing between this woman and the darkness that had tried to consume her. He let out a long, slow breath, a breath that seemed to carry the weight of the last 20 years of his life. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he let her see past the hardened exterior, past the stoic rancher, to the man beneath. He let her see the flicker of a fire that had been dormant for a long time, a fire that was now being stoked into a roaring blaze. He took a step closer, his hand coming up, not to touch her face, not yet, but to gently, almost reverently, touch her shoulder. His hand was large and callous, a stark contrast to her delicate frame. But his touch was surprisingly gentle. "Ain't about being pure," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble that filled the silent room. "It's about surviving. And I'm here to make sure you do." The words were a promise, a vow made in the fading light of a West Texas evening. They were a shield against the darkness of her past, the beacon in the uncertainty of her future. As the sun finally bled out below the horizon, plunging the world into the soft, forgiving darkness of twilight, a new chapter began for the scarred woman and the hardened rancher. A chapter written not in words, but in the silent, unshakable bond that had just been forged in the heart of the unforgiving frontier. The journey ahead would be long and perilous, fraught with the ghosts of her past and the dangers of a land that showed no mercy. But for the first time in a long time, Anna was not alone. And in the vast, lonely expanse of the West, that was the only thing that mattered. Chapter 2: Scars and Silence. The weight of his hand on her shoulder was both a comfort and a terror. For so long the man's touch had meant only pain, a prelude to violence that left her spirit as scarred as her skin. Anna flinched instinctively, a tremor running through her that was not from the evening chill but from the chilling ghost of memory. Yet, the hand did not tighten, did not shove, did not strike. It remained a steady, solid presence, the callous skin a testament to a life of hard work, not cruelty. It was a rancher's hand, a hand that knew the feel of rope and leather, the heft of an axe, the delicate task of helping a newborn calf to its feet. It was a hand that built and mended, and for a fleeting, incredulous moment, she allowed herself to wonder if it could mend her too. His words echoed in the cavern of her mind, chasing away the venomous whispers that had been her constant companions for years. "Ain't about being pure. It's about surviving." He hadn't recoiled. He hadn't turned away in disgust. He hadn't cast her out into the darkness that was already swallowing the plains. Instead, he had looked at the roadmap of her ruin and seen not a monster, but a survivor. The realization was so profound, so utterly alien to her experience, that it stole the air from her lungs. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped her tightly shut eyes and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek, a river of grief in a barren land. Jake felt the tremor under his palm, saw the tear escape. He held his ground, his gaze unwavering. He was navigating a minefield, and a single misstep could send her retreating back into the shell of silence she had so bravely, for a moment, emerged from. He had seen fear in the eyes of a cornered coyote and a horse with a broken leg, but the fear in Anna's eyes was something more profound. It was a fear of hope itself, as if daring to believe in kindness was the most dangerous gamble of all. The silence that fell between them now was different from the oppressive quiet that had preceded her confession. It was a fragile, tentative thing, a space for breathing, for processing. The fury in his gut had not subsided, but it had been banked, transformed from a wild, consuming fire into a steady, focused heat. He had a purpose now, one that went beyond the endless cycle of seasons and cattle drives. His promise to her was a brand on his own soul, an oath sworn to the deepening twilight. "Come," he said, his voice still low and rough, but softened at the edges. "Night's coming on. It gets cold." He finally removed his hand from her shoulder, and she felt its absence as a sudden, sharp loss. He turned and walked towards the stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the room. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived without waste, of energy conserved for the things that mattered. Anna watched him, her limbs frozen, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and a fragile, burgeoning sense of what? Relief. It was too soon for relief, but it was something. She wrapped her arms around herself, the familiar gesture of self-protection a hard habit to break. The shawl lay at her feet, a discarded skin. For the first time in months, she was standing in the presence of another person with her face uncovered, her shame laid bare. The air on her skin felt far and cold. Jake knelt before the hearth, striking a match against the stone. The sudden flare of light threw his rugged profile into sharp relief, a study in angles and shadows. He was not a handsome man in the way of city folk, with their smooth skin and soft hands. His was a face carved by the elements, weathered and strong. But in the flickering firelight, she saw something she hadn't seen before, a deep, abiding kindness in the set of his jaw, a weariness in his eyes that spoke not of weakness, but of burdens carried without complaint. The kindling caught, and soon a small, cheerful fire was crackling in the hearth, pushing back the encroaching darkness and filling the room with a warm, amber glow. The light danced on the scarred landscape of her face, and for a moment, she wanted to turn away, to hide in the shadows again. But she held his gaze, a silent test. He didn't flinch. He looked at her as if she were whole, as if the firelight was merely illuminating the woman she was, not the damage that had been done to her. "There's still left from supper," he said, rising to his feet and gesturing towards the pot that sat on the trivet by the fire. "You should eat." It was a simple, practical statement, but it was grounded in a reality she had almost forgotten. The world had been reduced to fear and flight, to survival on the most primal level. The idea of a quiet meal by a warm fire, of simple human comfort, felt like a dream from another life. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. They ate in silence, sitting at the rough-hewn table, the fire casting their shadows long and dancing on the wall behind them. The stew was thick and savory, with chunks of beef and potatoes that he had likely grown himself. It was a taste of the earth, of this place, of him. With each spoonful, Anna felt a little of her strength return. It was as if the simple act of eating, of nourishing her body, was an act of defiance against the man who had tried to destroy her. Jake ate slowly, his eyes on his plate. He was giving her space, allowing her to come to terms with the monumental shift that had just occurred between them. He knew that pushing for answers now would be a mistake. The story of her scars was hers to tell, in her own time, if she chose to tell it at all. For now, it was enough that she was here, that she was safe, that she had taken the first, terrifying step out of the shadows. When they were finished, he took her empty bowl, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth that shot up her arm. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her heart hammering against her ribs. He gave no sign that he had noticed, simply taking the bowls to the wash basin in the corner. The routine of the evening took over, a familiar rhythm that was both comforting and surreal. He washed, she dried. They moved around each other in the small space, a silent and practiced dance. The shawl still lay on the floor, and every time her gaze fell upon it, she felt a fresh wave of anxiety. But she didn't pick it up. To put it back on now would be a retreat, a rejection of the tentative truce he had offered. When the last of the chores were done, an awkwardness fell between them. The night was fully upon them now, a vast, stardusted blanket of blackness that stretched to infinity. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the lonely cry of a distant coyote. In the small cabin, the world was reduced to the two of them, two solitary souls bound together by a whispered confession and a solemn promise. "You should get some rest," Jake said, his voice breaking the silence. He gestured towards the small room that he had given her when she first arrived. It was little more than a closet, with a narrow cot and a small window that looked out onto the endless plains. But it was hers, a space that was safe. She nodded, turning to leave. But she stopped at the doorway, her back to him. There were 1,000 questions she wanted to ask, 1,000 things she needed to say. But the words were trapped behind a wall of fear and shame. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. It was all she could manage, but it felt inadequate, a pebble offered in return for a mountain. Jake was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You're safe here, Anna. No one will hurt you here." It was a simple statement of fact, spoken with a conviction that left no room for doubt. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. She retreated to her room, but not before she saw him take a blanket from a nearby chest and settle into the worn armchair by the fire. He was going to sleep there, in the main room, a silent guardian at her door. The lock on her door, a simple wooden bolt, suddenly felt redundant. The greatest protection she had was the man in the next room, a man who had seen the worst of her and had not turned away. Sleep did not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the face of her tormentor, a face contorted with a rage she had never understood. She felt the searing pain of the brand, the sharp, tearing agony of the knife, the brutal impact of his fist. His name was Marcus, and he had once promised her love, a home, a future. He had been a man of wealth and standing, a man with a charming smile and a darkness in his soul that she had been too young, too naive, to see. He had not just scarred her face, he had tried to obliterate her very being, to turn her into his possession, a broken thing that no other man would ever want. He had told her that her face was a testament to his love, a mark of ownership. And for a long time, she had believed him. But now, another man's words echoed in her mind, a quiet, steady counterpoint to Marcus's venom. "It's about surviving, survival." She had been so focused on hiding, on running, that she had forgotten what it meant to truly survive. Survival wasn't just about breathing, about staying one step ahead of the past. It was about reclaiming what had been taken. It was about finding the strength to live again, not just exist. She didn't know if she had that strength. The wounds on her soul were deeper, more painful, than the ones on her skin. But for the first time in a long time, a tiny, fragile seed of hope had been planted in the barren wasteland of her heart. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. The next morning, she awoke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pale pink and gold. She lay on her cot for a long moment, listening to the familiar sounds of Jake moving about the cabin. It was a domestic, comforting sound, a sound from a life she had never had. Taking a deep breath, she rose and dressed. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror that hung on the wall. The scars were still there, a permanent part of her. But this morning, for the first time, they seemed less like marks of shame and more like battle scars. A testament not to her brokenness, but to her resilience. A reminder that she had endured the unthinkable and had, against all odds, survived. She left the shawl on her bed. When she entered the main room, Jake was at the stove, his back to her. He had already been out, she could tell. His boots were dusty and there was a fresh bucket of water by the door. He turned as she entered, and his gaze flickered over her face, no longer hidden by the shawl. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of her bravery. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Coffee's hot." "Morning," she replied, her own voice still husky with sleep. The morning passed in a comfortable, if mostly silent, routine. After breakfast, Jake went out to tend to his cattle, leaving her alone in the cabin. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was peaceful. She swept the floors, kneaded dough for bread, and mended a tear in one of her sleeves. They were simple, ordinary tasks, but they grounded her, made her feel useful, a part of this place. When Jake returned for the midday meal, he brought with him a small, bedraggled wildflower, its purple petals a stark splash of color against the drab landscape. He didn't say anything, just placed it in a tin cup of water and set it on the table. It was a small, simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was a recognition of her as a woman, not just a refugee. It was a spot of beauty in a world that had shown her only ugliness. And it made her heart ache with an emotion she couldn't quite name. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Jake worked his ranch from sunup to sundown, a tireless, solitary figure against the vast, empty canvas of the plains. Anna took over the running of the house, her quiet competence transforming the dusty, neglected cabin into a clean, comfortable home. She cooked, and cleaned and mended, and in the quiet hours of the afternoon, she would sit on the porch, her face turned towards the sun, letting its warmth soak into her skin. They spoke little, but a silent understanding grew between them. He learned to read her moods in the set of her shoulders and the light in her eyes. She learned the meaning of his different silences, the weary silence of a long day's work, the contemplative silence of a man watching the sunset, the tense silence that meant he was worried about the lack of rain. She began to see the man beneath the hardened exterior. She saw the way he spoke to his horse, a low, gentle murmur that was more tender than any words he ever spoke to her. She saw the way he would leave a bowl of water out for the stray dog that sometimes haunted the edges of the property. She saw a man of deep, quiet kindness, a man whose strength was not in his fists, but in his steadfastness, his unwavering sense of honor. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he was cleaning his rifle, the lamplight glinting on the polished wood and steel. The silence was comfortable, familiar. "Where did you learn to stitch like that?" he asked, his voice casual, but his eyes were on the neat, almost invisible mend she had made on the cuff of his shirt. The question was unexpected, a foray into a past he had so far avoided. She tensed, her hands stilling in her lap. "My mother taught me," she said, her voice quiet. She was a seamstress. It was a small offering, a tiny piece of her past, and she waited to see what he would do with it. He just nodded, his attention returning to his rifle. "She taught you well." And that was it. No prying, no follow-up questions. He had accepted her offering and had not demanded more. It was a lesson in trust, and she felt a small, tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. A week later, he came back from a trip to the nearest town, a dusty, fly-blown settlement a day's ride away. He brought back the usual supplies: flour, coffee, salt. But he also brought her a small, paper-wrapped parcel. He handed it to her without a word, a flush of awkwardness on his weathered cheeks. She unwrapped it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a bar of scented soap, a small bottle of rosewater, and a comb made of polished bone. They were small, simple luxuries, but to her, they were a treasure beyond price. They were a recognition of her femininity, a quiet statement that he saw her as a woman, desirable and worthy of beautiful things. That night, she washed her hair with the scented soap and brushed it until it shone in the firelight. She dabbed a little of the rosewater on her wrists, the delicate scent a ghost of a life she had once dreamed of. When she entered the main room, Jake looked up from the ledger he was studying. His eyes met hers, and for a long moment, the world seemed to stop. He didn't say anything, but his gaze was filled with a raw and guarded admiration that made her skin tingle and her heart beat a little faster. In that moment, she realized with a jolt that she was no longer just a refugee in his home. She was becoming something more. And the realization was both terrifying and wonderful. But the past is not a ghost that is easily laid to rest. It has a way of reaching out, of casting long, dark shadows over the present. And as the fragile piece of their life together began to blossom, the storm clouds of Anna's past were gathering on the horizon, ready to unleash a tempest that would test their newfound bond to its very limits. The man who had scarred her was not a man to let go of what he considered his property. And he was coming. Chapter 3: The Shadow on the Plains. The piece they had found was as fragile as a desert flower, a beautiful, unexpected bloom in a harsh and unforgiving land. The days settled into a comfortable routine, a quiet domesticity that was a balm to Anna's wounded soul. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the language of the wind as it whispered through the dry grass, the comfort of a shared silence. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt safe. She began to sleep through the night without the familiar specter of Marcus haunting her dreams. The coiled spring of tension in her shoulders began to unwind, and sometimes a small, tentative smile would touch her lips, a fleeting but beautiful thing that made Jake's heart ache. He watched the transformation in her with a quiet, fierce protectiveness. He saw the light returning to her eyes, the ghost of a woman she might have been before her world was shattered. He found himself looking for reasons to make her smile, to hear the soft, rusty sound of her laugh, which he had heard only once, when the stray dog had tripped over its own paws trying to chase a jackrabbit. The sound had been like a sudden, unexpected rain in a drought, and he had found himself wanting to hear it again with a desperation that was both unfamiliar and unsettling. He never touched her, other than the occasional accidental brush of hands as they worked. He knew that the ground they stood on was fragile, that a single misstep could send her retreating back into the fortress of her past. But the space between them was charged with an unspoken awareness, a growing attraction that was as undeniable as the heat of the Texas sun. He would watch her as she worked, the graceful line of her neck as she bent over her sewing, the way the firelight caught the red highlights in her dark hair. And he would feel a surge of a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, a feeling that was both dangerous and intoxicating. He had been a solitary man for so long, had convinced himself that he was content with his own company, with the stoic companionship of his horse and the endless, empty horizon. He had loved once, a long time ago, a woman with a bright, adventurous spirit who had not been able to endure the harsh, lonely reality of ranch life. She had left, and she had taken a piece of his heart with her, leaving him with a cynical distrust of love and a conviction that he was destined to be alone. But Anna, with her quiet strength and her haunted eyes, was chipping away at the walls he had built around his heart, and he was both terrified and powerless to stop it. Anna, too, was aware of the shifting sands of their relationship. She found herself watching him as he worked, admiring the raw, masculine power in the swing of his axe, the gentle way he handled a newborn calf. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, the deep, biting solitude of a man who had made his peace with a life devoid of softness and comfort. And she felt a burgeoning desire to be that for him, to bring a little warmth and light into his stark, monochrome world. The fear was still there, a constant, low-level hum beneath the surface of her newfound peace. The fear of Marcus, of the past catching up with her. But there was a new fear now, a fear of a different kind. A fear of what she was beginning to feel for this quiet, steadfast man who had shown her a kindness she had thought no longer existed in the world. To love again, to trust again, felt like a betrayal of the vows of survival she had made to herself. It felt like an invitation for more pain, more heartbreak. And yet, her heart, which she had thought was dead and buried, was beginning to stubbornly, traitorously, beat again. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a lone rider, a speck on the horizon that slowly grew larger as he approached the ranch. It was an unusual sight. Visitors were rare in this isolated corner of the world. Jake, who had been mending a fence line, straightened up, his hand instinctively going to the Colt holstered at his hip. He watched the rider approach, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. Anna, who had been hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, saw the rider too. A cold, familiar dread washed over her, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She froze, the wet sheet clutched in her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every stranger was a potential threat, every new face a possible harbinger of the doom she had been running from. The rider was a stocky and shaven man with a mean, pinched face and small, cunning eyes. He reined in his horse a respectful distance from the house, but his gaze was insolent as it swept over the property, lingering on Anna for a long and comfortable moment before settling on Jake. "Howdy," the man said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Looking for a man named Jake. This be his place?" "I'm Jake," Jake said, his voice flat, his stance unwelcoming. "What's your business?" The man spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dry ground, a gesture of casual contempt. "Name's Jed. I'm looking for someone. A woman. She might have passed this way." He gave a detailed description of Anna, a description that was chillingly accurate, right down to the small mole just above her left eyebrow. A detail that only someone who had known her intimately would know. Anna felt the blood drain from her face. She dropped the sheet and fled into the cabin, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She bolted the door, her back pressed against the rough wood, her body trembling uncontrollably. He had sent someone. Marcus had sent someone. He was looking for her. The fragile piece she had built was a lie, a house of cards about to be blown away by the storm that was coming. Outside, Jake's face had become a mask of cold fury. His hand was no longer near his gun, it was on it, his thumb resting on the hammer. "Ain't seen no woman like that," he said, his voice as hard and unyielding as the land around them. "You're mistaken." Jed's eyes narrowed, a flicker of amusement in their depths. "That's so. Funny, 'cause the woman I just saw duck into your house looked a whole lot like the one I'm describing." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's a reward, you know. A handsome one. The man she belongs to, a Mr. Marcus Thorne, is a very wealthy, very powerful man, and he's very eager to have his property returned." The word property hung in the air, a vile, poisonous thing. It confirmed everything Jake had suspected, everything he had seen in the scars on Anna's face. The cold fury in his gut ignited into a white-hot rage. "She ain't property," Jake said, his voice dangerously low. "And she ain't here. Now, I suggest you get on your horse and ride out. And you can tell Mr. Marcus Thorne that if he or any of his men ever set foot on my land again, they'll be carried off it." Jed's smirk faltered. He saw the look in Jake's eyes, the cold, deadly promise of a man who was not making an idle threat. He was a bully and a coward, used to intimidating people with the power of his employer's name. He was not prepared for a man who was not afraid, a man who looked like he had been born with a gun in his hand. He hesitated for a moment, then seemed to think better of it. He grunted, pulling on his reins and turning his horse. "You're making a mistake, rancher," he spat. "A big one. Mr. Thorne ain't a man you want to cross." "Get off my land," Jake said, his voice a whip crack. Jed spurred his horse into a gallop, kicking up a cloud of dust as he retreated back the way he had come. Jake stood there for a long time, watching until the rider was once again a speck on the horizon. The silence that descended was heavier, more ominous, than any silence that had come before. The shadow had found them. He turned and walked back to the cabin, his face grim. The door was bolted. He knocked gently. "Anna, it's me." "He's gone." There was a long silence from within, then the sound of the bolt being drawn back. The door opened a crack, and she looked out at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terror that clawed at his heart. "He's gone," he repeated, his voice softer now. "You're safe." She opened the door fully and launched herself into his arms, her body racked with violent, silent sobs. He was startled for a moment, then his arms came around her, holding her tight against his chest. She was so small, so fragile, and she was trembling like a leaf in a storm. He held her, stroking her hair, murmuring soft, comforting words, his own heart pounding with a mixture of rage and a fierce, primal protectiveness. He had known this day would come. He had known that a man like the one who had scarred her would not simply let her go. He had been living on borrowed time, and the debt had just been called in. When her sobs finally subsided, she pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Don't be," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He led her to the table and sat her down, then poured her a glass of water. "You need to tell me everything, Anna," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You need to tell me about Marcus Thorne." And so, she did. In a low, halting voice, she told him everything. She told him about the charming, handsome man who had swept her off her feet, a poor seamstress's daughter with dreams of a better life. She told him about the whirlwind romance, the promises of love and marriage. And then she told him about the darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface, a possessive, jealous rage that had erupted with terrifying violence. She told him about the beatings, the isolation, the way he had systematically stripped her of her identity, her will, her very soul. And she told him about the night she had finally found the courage to run, a night of terror that had ended with him catching her, branding her face with a hot poker, telling her that if he couldn't have her, no one would. She had escaped, but she had been running ever since, from town to town, always looking over her shoulder, always waiting for the day when he would find her. Jake listened, his face a grim, unreadable mask, but his hands were clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles white. The story was worse than anything he could have imagined, a tale of monstrous cruelty and unimaginable suffering. The rage he had felt before was nothing compared to the cold, murderous fury that now settled in his heart. When she was finished, a heavy silence fell between them. The story hung in the air, a raw, ugly thing. "He won't stop," Anna whispered, her voice filled with a hopeless despair. "He'll send more men. He'll come himself. He'll never stop. Then we'll be ready for him," Jake said, his voice a low, determined growl. From that day on, the fragile peace of the ranch was shattered. A new tension settled over the place, a constant, watchful vigilance. Jake became a man possessed. He spent his days fortifying the ranch, checking and rechecking his weapons, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He taught Anna how to use a rifle, his hands gentle but firm as he showed her how to load, aim, and fire. She was a natural, her hands steady, her eye true. The feel of the weapon in her hands was both terrifying and empowering. It was a symbol of the violence she had endured, but it was also a tool of defiance, a promise that she would not be a victim again. The nights were the hardest. They would sit by the fire, the silence between them filled with a new and spoken tension. The shared danger had forged a new intimacy between them, a bond that was deeper, more potent than anything that had come before. The physical space between them seemed to have shrunk, the air crackling with an energy that was both exciting and frightening. One night, a storm rolled in, a violent, spectacular display of lightning and thunder that shook the very foundations of the small cabin. Anna, who had always been terrified of storms, found herself not with Jake. He had not offered any words of comfort, but he had pulled his armchair closer to hers, his solid, reassuring presence a silent bulwark against the fury of the storm. In a lull between claps of thunder, she looked at him, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. The rugged lines of his face seemed softer in the warm glow. His eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with a raw and guarded emotion as he looked back at her. "I'm afraid," she whispered, the confession a raw, honest admission of the terror that was her constant companion. "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble that was more comforting than the thunder was frightening. "But you're not alone anymore." He reached out then, his calloused fingers gently tracing the line of the scar on her cheek. It was the first time he had ever touched her face, and his touch was not one of pity or disgust, but of a reverence that made her breath catch in her throat. It was a touch that said he saw her, all of her, the scars and the pain and the strength beneath. It was a touch that said he accepted her, that he cherished her. And in that moment, with the storm raging outside and the fire crackling within, something shifted between them, a final, irrevocable click of a lock falling into place. The fear was still there, the danger was still real, but it was no longer the only thing. There was something else now, something powerful and beautiful and terrifying in its intensity. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut, and he closed the small distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both a question and an answer, a promise and a prayer. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and longing, after lonely, broken souls finding solace and strength in each other. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and rain and the silent and spoken promise of a dawn that they would fight to see, together. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of storm had broken, one that would change them both forever. The shadow on the plains was still there, but for the first time, they had a light to fight it with, the fierce and wavering light of a love forged in the heart of the fire. I will continue to write the remaining chapters, each building upon the last with the requested length and narrative style. The story will escalate, bringing the conflict with Marcus to a head and testing the bond between Jake and Anna, before moving towards a resolution and conclusion in the final chapters. Chapter 4: A Fragile Dawn. The storm outside had broken, its fury spent, leaving behind a world washed clean and silent. Inside the small cabin, a different kind of quiet had settled, one thick with the aftermath of a kiss that had changed everything. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, intimate light on Jake and Anna, who sat not feet apart, but inches, the energy between them a palpable thing. The kiss had not been an end, but a beginning, a violent, beautiful collision of two solitary worlds, and now, in the stillness that followed, they had to navigate the new landscape they had created. Jake was the first to move. He reached out, not to kiss her again, but to gently brush a stray strand of hair from her scarred cheek. His touch was hesitant, almost clumsy, as if he were handling something infinitely precious and was terrified of breaking it. The calloused pads of his fingers were rough against her skin, but the intent behind the touch was the softest thing she had ever known. He saw the faint tremor that ran through her, the flicker of old fear in her eyes, and he slowly pulled his hand back, giving her space. "Anna," he said, his voice a low rumble, the sound seeming to vibrate through the very floorboards. He didn't know what to say next. He was a man of actions, not words. He could break a horse, mend a fence, face down a charging bull, but the delicate, intricate terrain of a woman's heart was a wilderness he had never learned to navigate, especially a heart as bruised and weary as hers. She looked at him, her eyes, those deep, expressive pools that held so much pain, now also held a question. It was a question of trust, of hope, of what this moment meant in the cold light of day. Her lips, still tender from the force of his kiss, parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. What could she say? How could she explain the maelstrom of emotions within her, the terrifying joy of feeling something again, warring with the deep-seated conviction that she was unworthy of it, that it would only be taken from her? "Ian," he started, then stopped, frustrated with his own inadequacy. He took a breath and tried again. "I ain't a man for pretty words. Never have been. The life I've lived it don't leave much room for 'em." He looked at his own hands, large and scarred, a roadmap of a hard life. "My wife, the one I had, a long time ago, she said I had a silence in me that was bigger than the whole damn plains. She was right. She needed words, and I had none to give her. She needed a softer life than this place could offer. So she left." It was the most he had ever spoken of his past, a confession to match hers. He was showing her his own scars, the ones that weren't visible on the skin. He was telling her that he, too, was damaged goods, that he understood what it was to be left, to be deemed not enough. Anna listened, her gaze unwavering. She saw the flicker of old pain in his eyes, the ghost of a heartbreak he had carried alone for years. And in that moment, her own fear receded, replaced by a wave of profound empathy. He was not a saint, not a flawless hero from a storybook. He was a man, lonely and wounded, who had seen her own wounds and had not turned away. She reached out, her hand small and delicate against his rough, weathered one. She didn't speak, but she intertwined her fingers with his. The gesture was an answer, a promise, an acceptance of his silence and his scars. It said, "I am not afraid of your silence. I have lived in silence my whole life, and I am not the woman who left." A deep, shuddering breath escaped him, a breath he seemed to have been holding for a decade. He squeezed her hand, a silent communication that was more eloquent than any poem. The embers in the hearth glowed, a warm, beating heart in the center of their small, fortified world. They didn't need words. They had the quiet language of survivors, a language of shared glances, of gentle touches, of a silent promise to face the coming dawn, together. The dawn, when it came, was breathtakingly beautiful, a cruel irony given the ugliness they knew was coming. The sky was painted in strokes of rose and gold, and the rain-washed air was crisp and clean. But the beauty was tinged with menace. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound magnified. The familiar landscape was no longer a place of solitude, but a place of concealment. An enemy could be lurking behind any rock, any cluster of mesquite. The new intimacy between them was not forgotten in the morning light. It was there in the way he poured her coffee, the way their eyes met and held for a beat too long over the rim of their cups. It was there in the easy way they moved around each other in the small cabin, a silent, synchronized dance that spoke of a new, deeper connection. But the reality of their situation was a harsh, unavoidable presence. "He'll send more than one man next time," Jake said, his voice grim as he looked out the window, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "That Jed fellow was just a scout, a dog sniffing the trail. When Thorne comes, he'll come to finish it." Anna came to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his. She looked out at the same empty horizon, but she was no longer seeing it through a haze of terror. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now tempered by a new, unfamiliar feeling, resolve. "Then I'll be ready," she said, her voice quiet but firm. And so their days took on a new, urgent rhythm. Their life was no longer divided into his work and her work. It was a single, shared purpose, survival. Jake's training of Anna with the rifle intensified. He was a patient, methodical teacher. He taught her not just to shoot, but to think like a hunter. He took her out onto the plains, showing her how the land could be both an enemy and an ally. You don't just look at the land, he told her, his hand sweeping across the vast expanse. You read it. See that rise over there? A man on a horse would be silhouetted against the sky. Easy target. See that dry creek bed? Good cover, but it's a natural funnel. A perfect place for an ambush. You gotta see the lines, the angles, where a man can hide, and where he's exposed. He taught her to breathe, to control the frantic beating of her heart, to squeeze the trigger on the exhale, to make every shot count. A panicked shot is a wasted shot, he repeated, over and over. And we ain't got shots to waste. She was a quick study, her focus absolute. The rifle, once a terrifying object, became an extension of her will. There was a grim satisfaction in the solid kick against her shoulder and the loud report that echoed across the plains. In the puff of dust as her bullet struck the tin can he had set up on a fence post 50 yards away. Each successful shot was a small victory, a reclamation of the power that had been stolen from her. But their preparations were not just about guns. They worked together to fortify the cabin. They barred the windows with heavy wooden shutters that could be closed from the inside. They reinforced the door, bracing it with a heavy iron beam. Jake dug a trench at the back of the cabin, a last-ditch defensive position that offered a clear line of sight to the front of the house and the barn. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown, the shared labor forging a new kind of intimacy between them. There was a simple, profound pleasure in the rhythm of their work, and unspoken understanding that passed between them. He would anticipate her need for a tool. She would have a canteen of water ready for him before he even realized he was thirsty. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, nursing their aching muscles, and watch the sun bleed across the sky. In these quiet moments, the wall of silence between them would sometimes crumble. She would tell him small stories of her childhood, of her mother's gentle hands, and the smell of the fabric in her small shop. He, in turn, would tell her about the land, about the different types of cattle, about the hawk that nested in the tall cottonwood by the creek, about a life that was hard and lonely but also possessed of a stark, simple beauty. They were building a life together, a real life, in the shadow of death. And this fragile, beautiful thing they were creating was what they were now fighting for. It wasn't just her life anymore, or his. It was theirs. One afternoon, a week after Jed's visit, Jake found something that brought the threat into sharp, terrifying focus. He had been checking the perimeter of his property, a habit that had become a ritual, when he found new tracks. Not horse tracks, but boot prints. To men, by the look of it, they had been careful, trying to stick to the rocky ground where they would leave less of a trail. But they had made a mistake, cutting across a patch of soft sand near the dry creek bed. He followed the tracks, his body cold with tension. They led to a small, rocky outcropping that overlooked the ranch. From here, the man could watch the cabin, the barn, everything, without being seen. And on the ground, he found a freshly discarded cigarillo, the same brand that Jed had been smoking. They were being watched. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. Marcus Thorne's men were out there, in the vast, empty plains, and they were watching, waiting. It was a war of nerves, a slow, deliberate tightening of the noose. He didn't tell Anna about the tracks. He saw no reason to add to her fear. But that night, as they sat by the fire, she sensed a change in him. The comfortable silence was gone, replaced by a tense, watchful quiet. "What is it?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. He looked at her, at the strength and resilience that he had seen blossom in her over the past weeks. He had promised to protect her, and that meant protecting her from fear as much as from physical harm. But it also meant trusting her to be his partner in this, not just someone to be protected. He took a breath. "They're out there," he said, his voice low, "watching us." She didn't gasp, didn't cry. Her face paled, but her gaze remained steady. She simply nodded, a grim acceptance of the inevitable. "How long do you think we have?" she asked, her voice betraying only the slightest tremor. "Not long," he said. "He's testing us, trying to wear us down. When he thinks we're at our weakest, that's when he'll come." She looked into the fire, the flames dancing in her eyes. "He thinks I'm weak," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He thinks that because he broke my face, he broke me. He's wrong. She looked up at him, her eyes blazing with a fire that matched the one in the hearth. Let him come. Jake looked at the woman before him, and he felt a surge of pride and admiration so fierce it almost took his breath away. This was not the terrified, broken ghost he had found by the creek bed. This was a warrior, forged in the crucible of unimaginable pain, a woman who had looked into the abyss and had not blinked. He knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that they would not be facing the coming storm as a hardened rancher and a victim. They would be facing it as equals, as partners, as two solitary souls who had found in each other not just a refuge, but a reason to fight. The night was dark, and the shadows were gathering, but for the first time, he believed they might just be strong enough to see the dawn. Chapter 5: The Serpent's Coil. The knowledge that they were being watched changed the very air they breathed. The vast, open plains, once a symbol of solitude and freedom, now felt claustrophobic, a stage on which they were then willing actors. Every gust of wind seemed to carry a whisper, every shadow seemed to hold a man. The days of quiet, shared labor were over, replaced by a tense, hyper-vigilant state of readiness. Sleep became a luxury, snatched in brief, restless shifts, one of them always awake, always watching, rifle in hand. The psychological toll was immense. The constant, unrelenting tension frayed their nerves raw. A coyote's howl in the night would have them both on their feet, guns in hand. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, was enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through their veins. It was the slow, deliberate torture that Marcus Thorne had intended. He was not just coming for Anna, he was savoring the hunt, tightening the serpent's coil around them, waiting for them to break. After 3 days of this siege of the senses, Jake knew they couldn't last. They were an island, and their supplies were finite. More importantly, he needed information. He needed to know the lay of the land, not just his own, but in the town of Redemption, the dusty, sun-baked settlement that was the closest thing to civilization for 50 miles. "I have to go to town," he announced one morning, his voice leaving no room for argument. Anna's head snapped up from the piece of leather she was mending. "No," she said, her voice sharp with fear. "You can't. It's what they're waiting for. They want to separate us." "And what happens when we run out of coffee?" he countered, his tone lighter than he felt. "Or flour. Or ammunition. We can't just sit here and wait for them to starve us out or for our well to run dry. I need to see what Jed has been up to. I need to know who's on Thorne's payroll and who, if anyone, might be on our side." He was right, and she knew it. But the thought of him leaving, of being alone in the cabin, even for a day, was a cold, hard fist of fear in her gut. She looked at him, at his steady, determined face, and she saw the truth of it. To stay here and hide was to cede control to Marcus. To act, to seek information, was to fight back. "I'll be careful," he said, his voice softening as he saw the conflict in her eyes. "I'll be back before nightfall. You're a good shot, Anna. You know this land now. You'll be safe." He placed his hands on her shoulders, his gaze intense. "Bolt the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone. Not for any reason. Shoot at anything that doesn't look right. Don't hesitate." She nodded, swallowing the lump of fear in her throat. "Be safe, Jake," she whispered. He saddled his horse, Buck, a powerful, intelligent animal that had been his companion for years. He checked his Colt, slid his Winchester into the scabbard on the saddle, and with a final, lingering look at Anna standing in the doorway of the cabin, he rode out. The ride to Redemption was tense. Every rock, every gully, every cluster of sagebrush was a potential ambush site. Jake rode with his rifle across his lap, his eyes constantly scanning, his senses on high alert. He saw no one, but the feeling of being watched was a prickle on the back of his neck that never went away. Redemption was a town that lived up to its name only in irony. It was a dusty, wind-blown collection of false-fronted buildings, a place where dreams came to die and hope was a currency more valuable than gold. It had one main street, 2 saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, and a sheriff's office that was usually empty. As Jake rode down the main street, he felt the change immediately. Usually, his arrival would warrant a few cursory nods, the silent acknowledgement of a fellow survivor in this harsh land. Today, it was different. Men stopped their conversations to stare at him, their gazes a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and veiled hostility. Windows that had been open were suddenly shuttered. The air was thick with a poison that had been deliberately spread. He dismounted in front of the general store, tying Buck to the hitching post. He took a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior, his hand never far from his gun. The store was run by a man named Silas, a gaunt, perpetually worried man who had always been fair in his dealings. "Jake," Silas said, his voice a nervous squeak. He was polishing the counter with a rag, a task he seemed to have been engaged in for some time. He didn't meet Jake's eye. "Silas," Jake said, his voice level. "Need some supplies. Coffee, flour, and a box of .44 cartridges." Silas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin neck. "I can get you the coffee and flour, Jake," he said, his eyes darting towards the door. "But I'm all out of the .44s. A fella came through yesterday, bought up my whole stock." Jake's blood ran cold. "A fella?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "He have a name?" "Didn't say," Silas mumbled, his gaze fixed on the countertop. "But he paid in gold coin. Said there might be more gold for folks who were helpful." Jed. It had to be. He had not only scouted Jake's land, he had scouted the town. He had bought up the ammunition Jake would need, and he had spread Thorne's money around, buying silence and complicity. "And what else did this fella have to say, Silas?" Jake pressed, his voice hard. Silas finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and shame. "He was asking questions, Jake. About you. About the woman you've got out at your place. He was spinning a yarn, said she was a thief, that she'd stolen a fortune from her husband, and that you were holding her for a piece of the take." The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Marcus was not only trying to isolate them physically, but to turn the entire community against them, painting Jake not as a protector, but as a criminal. "And you believed him?" Jake asked, his voice laced with contempt. "People believe what they want to believe, Jake," Silas whispered, "especially when there's gold involved. Redemption's a hard town. A man's got a family to feed." Disgusted, Jake paid for the coffee and flour and left. His next stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a large, lazy man who had won his badge in a poker game and whose primary occupation was keeping his chair warm. Jake found him with his boots up on his desk, a cheap novel in his hands. "Brody," Jake said, standing in the doorway, blocking the light. Brody looked up, his expression one of weary annoyance. "What do you want, Jake?" "I'm in the middle of a chapter. A man named Marcus Thorne is coming to my land to cause trouble. He's already sent men to scout my place and to spread lies and money around this town. I'm telling you now, as a law-abiding citizen, that I expect you to do your job." Brody slowly took his feet off the desk. A flicker of something fear, greed, crossed his face. "Now, hold on, Jake. I heard about this. A man's got a right to get his property back, especially a man like Mr. Thorne. I hear he's a very important man, with connections back east." "She's not property, Brody. She's a woman, and Thorne is the criminal. He tried to kill her." Brody sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation. "That's a serious accusation, Jake. You got any proof?" "All I got is the word of his man, Jed, and a handful of gold eagles that says Mr. Thorne is an upstanding citizen looking for what's his." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "My advice to you, stay out of it. Give the woman up. It ain't your fight." Jake stared at the sheriff, at the weak, corrupt heart of this so-called town, and he felt a profound, chilling sense of isolation. They were utterly, completely alone. There would be no help. No one was coming to save them. The law was for sale, and Marcus Thorne had bought it. "You're a disgrace to that badge, Brody," Jake said, his voice low and filled with contempt. He turned and walked out, leaving the sheriff to his novel and his cowardice. As he was untying Buck, a small, grimy boy, no older than 10, tugged on his sleeve. "Mister," the boy whispered, his eyes wide. "The blacksmith, old man Hemlock, he told me to give you this." The boy pressed a small, heavy cloth bundle into his hand and then scurried away before Jake could say a word. Jake looked at the bundle. He could feel the distinct shape of cartridges through the cloth. He opened it. Inside were 2 dozen .44 rounds, gleaming and deadly. And wrapped around them was a small, scorched piece of leather with a single word burned into it, "Fight." A small, grim smile touched Jake's lips. Hemlock was a surly, silent old man who had been in redemption for 30 years and barely spoke to anyone. But he was a man of principle, a man from an older time. He couldn't speak out, but he had sent a message. There was at least one person in this town who had not been bought. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a flicker of light in the darkness. The ride back to the ranch was even more tense than the ride in. Jake knew now that Thorne's net was cast wide. He pushed Buck harder, an urgent need to get back to Anna gnawing at him. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Anna was living through her own private hell. The silence after Jake left was a living thing, a monstrous, breathing entity that filled every corner of the small house. She did her chores with a frantic energy, trying to keep the fear at bay, but her ears were constantly strained, listening for the sound of hoofbeats, for the crunch of a boot on gravel. Around noon, she heard it. A horse, moving slowly, deliberately, on the far side of the barn. Her heart leaped into her throat. It wasn't Jake. He would have approached from the front. She grabbed the rifle, her hands slick with sweat, and moved to the window, her body trembling. Peeking through a crack in the shutters, she saw him. A man, dismounted, leading his horse, using the barn as cover to approach the house. It wasn't Jed. This man was tall and weary, with a cruel, thin-lipped mouth. Her training with Jake took over. She didn't panic. She moved away from the window, her back pressed against the wall, the rifle held at the ready. She controlled her breathing, just as he had taught her. She was a hunter now, and this was her territory. The man was creeping towards the front of the house. She heard the soft thud of his boots, the jingle of his spurs. He was trying the front door, rattling the handle. He cursed under his breath when he found it bolted. Then, silence. Anna's heart was hammering so loud she was sure he could hear it. Where had he gone? She crept to the other side of the cabin, to the small window that looked out towards the back. And then she saw him. He was trying to circle around, to find another way in. He thought she was a helpless, frightened woman, alone and ripe for the taking. She raised the rifle, resting the barrel on the windowsill. She lined up the sights on his chest. Her finger tightened on the trigger. He was less than 30 yards away. An easy shot. She could end this, right now. But she hesitated. To kill a man, even a man who had come to harm her, was a line she had never thought she would have to cross. The face of Marcus, contorted in rage, flashed in her mind. This man was just a tool, a weapon sent by the real monster. Just as her finger was about to squeeze the trigger, the stray dog that haunted the ranch, a scruffy, half-starved creature that Jake sometimes left scraps for, suddenly shot out from under the porch, barking and snarling with a ferocity that was startling in its intensity. The man, caught by surprise, jumped back, pulling his gun. He fired a shot at the dog, kicking up a cloud of dust near its paws. The dog, yelping, retreated back under the porch. But the element of surprise was gone. The man looked at the house, his eyes filled with a new, wary respect. He clearly hadn't counted on a watchdog. Cursing, he holstered his gun, retreated to his horse, and rode off, disappearing over the rise. Anna sank to the floor, the rifle clattering beside her, her body shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. She had been tested, and she hadn't fired. Was that weakness or strength? She didn't know. But she was alive, and she was still safe. When Jake galloped into the yard an hour later, she flew out the door and into his arms, the story tumbling out of her in a torrent of relieved, frightened words. He held her tight, his face grim, as he listened. He looked at the spot where the man had stood, at the small puff of disturbed dust where the bullet had hit. He held her at arm's length, his hands on her shoulders. "You did good, Anna," he said, his voice filled with a fierce pride. "You did everything right. You stayed calm. You were ready. Not pulling the trigger, that wasn't weakness. That was you deciding. You were in control. That's what matters." That night, as they shared the meager supplies he had brought back from town, he told her what he had learned. He told her about the lies, about the sheriff, about the ammunition. And he told her about the blacksmith's message. The reality of their situation settled over them, a heavy, suffocating blanket. They were outcasts, branded as criminals. They had no allies, no one to call for help. The serpent's coil had tightened. They were completely, utterly on their own, a tiny island of defiance in a sea of hostility. "So this is it," Anna said, her voice quiet but steady. Just us. Just us, Jake confirmed, his hand finding hers across the small table. It's enough. He looked at her, at the woman who had faced down one of Thorne's men and had not broken, and he knew he was right. It was enough. They were enough. The world had turned against them, but in this small cabin, they had forged a bond that was stronger than any lie, more valuable than any gold. They were cornered, outnumbered, and outgunned, but they were not beaten. The fight was coming, and they would face it together. Chapter 6. The Gathering Storm. The encounter with the Lone Rider and Jake's grim report from Redemption served as a final, brutal confirmation. The time for waiting was over. The psychological games were just a prelude. The physical assault was coming, and it was coming soon. The air itself seemed to have grown heavy, charged with the premonition of violence, like the dead, oppressive stillness before a thunderstorm. A sense of finality settled over the small ranch. Every sunrise felt like a gift, every sunset a potential farewell. Their days were no longer just about preparation, they were about ritual. They moved with a quiet, focused intensity, their every action geared towards the coming fight. There was a new and spoken tenderness between them, a desperate need to cherish the fragile moments of peace they had left. A shared cup of coffee in the pre-dawn light, a lingering touch as they passed in the narrow confines of the cabin, a long, silent moment watching the stars come out. These small acts of intimacy became acts of defiance, a refusal to let Marcus Thorne's shadow poison everything they had built. Jake, pragmatic and methodical, channeled his rage into action. We can't outfight them, not in an open field, he explained one morning, sketching a rough map of the ranch in the dirt with a stick. But this is our land. We know every rock, every dip, every shadow. That's our advantage. We make them come to us. We make them pay for every single foot of ground. Together, they turned the ranch into a fortress. It was a grim, desperate business. They dug the trench behind the house deeper, reinforcing it with rocks and thick planks of wood. They piled up barricades of old furniture and sacks of feed inside the cabin, creating fortified positions at each window. Jake spent an entire day rigging a simple but effective early warning system, a series of tripwires made from thin, almost invisible twine, strung across the most likely avenues of approach. Each wire was connected to a small stack of tin cans that would create a deafening clatter if disturbed. It wouldn't stop anyone, but it would rob them of the element of surprise. Anna worked alongside him, her hands, once soft and skilled only with a needle, now becoming calloused and strong. She hauled rocks, filled sacks with dirt, and learned to tie the intricate knots for the tripwires. There was a grim satisfaction in the work. With every stone she laid, every sack she filled, she felt as if she were building a wall not just around the cabin, but around herself, fortifying her own spirit against the coming onslaught. She was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a combatant, actively participating in her own defense. Jake watched her, a constant ache of pride and fear in his chest. He saw the grim determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw. The transformation was astonishing. The haunted, fragile woman he had found was gone, replaced by this fierce, resilient warrior. He had wanted to protect her, to be her shield against the world. But he was realizing now that she was not a shield to be hidden behind. She was a second sword, sharp and true, to be wielded alongside his own. One evening, as they finished their work for the day, covered in dust and sweat, Anna turned to him, her eyes dark with a fear she had not allowed herself to show before. "Jake," she said, her voice low and trembling slightly. "If something happens, if they get past us, I don't want him to take me. I won't go back to that." She looked at the rifle in her hands, then at him, her meaning clear and terrible. Jake's heart constricted. He took the rifle from her hands and set it aside. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against him, his face buried in her hair. "That's not going to happen," he said, his voice a fierce, ragged whisper against her ear. "Do you hear me? I will die before I let him lay a hand on you again. That is a promise." "But that's what I'm afraid of," she cried, her voice muffled against his chest. "I'm afraid you'll die for me. I couldn't live with that. I couldn't bear it." He held her at arm's length, his hands gripping her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. His eyes, usually so guarded, were blazing with an intensity that stole her breath. "Listen to me, Anna. This stopped being just about you a long time ago. This is my home. You are my life now. A man's got a right to defend his home and his life. This isn't me dying for you. This is me living for you. For us. There's a difference. His words, raw and unadorned, were the most beautiful declaration of love she had ever heard. They cut through her fear, her guilt, her deep-seated feeling of worthlessness. He wasn't saving her out of pity or duty. He was fighting for a future he wanted, a future that included her. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming gratitude, of a love so fierce and unexpected it felt like it might break her heart open. She reached up, her hands cupping his rough and shaven cheeks, and pulled his face down to hers. Their kiss was not like the first one, which had been born of desperation and a sudden storm of emotion. This was a kiss of deep, abiding love, of a conscious, deliberate choice. It was a seal on the pact they had made, a final, silent vow in the face of the coming darkness. That night, there was no pretense of one sleeping while the other watched. The storm was coming, and they both knew this might be their last night of peace, their last night on earth. They went to his room, to the large, sturdy bed he had built with his own hands. The act of love that followed was not a frantic, desperate coupling. It was a slow, tender, almost reverent exploration. It was an act of claiming and of being claimed, an act of defiance against the man who had tried to turn intimacy into a weapon and a woman's body into a thing of shame. For Anna, it was a revelation. With Jake, there was no pain, no fear, no humiliation. There was only tenderness, and reverence, and a profound, bone-deep sense of being cherished. He worshipped her with his hands, with his mouth, with his body, and in his arms. She felt not impure, not damaged, but beautiful and whole and infinitely precious. She was reclaiming not just her body, but her very soul, washing away the stain of Marcus's brutality with the healing balm of a good man's love. For Jake, it was a homecoming. He had been alone for so long, had forgotten the simple, profound comfort of holding another person through the night. To be with Anna, to feel her heart beat against his, to lose himself in her, was to find a part of himself he had thought was long dead and buried. It was to feel life, potent and precious, coursing through his veins, giving him something more to fight for than just his own survival. They lay tangled in each other's arms as the moon traced its path across the sky, speaking in low whispers, sharing secrets and dreams in the intimate darkness. They did not speak of the morning, of what it might bring. They existed only in the now, in this small, perfect bubble of time they had carved out for themselves. The first, faint hint of dawn was painting the eastern sky a pale, ghostly gray when the sound came. A sharp, metallic clatter from the direction of the creek bed, followed by a muffled curse. One of the tripwires. Jake was out of the bed in an instant, pulling on his pants, his movements fluid and economical. Anna was right behind him, dressing with a speed and efficiency born of weeks of practice. The tender intimacy of the night was gone, shattered by the harsh reality of the morning. The lovers were gone. The warriors were back. They took their positions at the windows, rifles in hand, their hearts pounding in a grim, steady rhythm. The waiting was over. As the light grew, they saw them. Not 2 or 3 men, but 8 of them, emerging from the pre-dawn gloom like specters, spreading out, forming a loose, menacing semicircle around the ranch house. They were heavily armed, their faces hard and grim in the pale light. And at their center, sitting on a magnificent black stallion, was a man who could only be Marcus Thorne. Even at a distance, he radiated an aura of arrogant, confident power. He was dressed not in rough frontier garb, but in a tailored, expensive-looking coat, a stark, civilized figure in this raw and tamed landscape. He raised a hand, and his men halted. He then rode forward alone, stopping 100 yards from the cabin, well out of pistol range but close enough for his voice to carry on the still morning air. "Anna," he called out, his voice smooth and cultured, yet carrying an edge of cold steel. It was a voice that had once whispered promises of love to her, and had later screamed curses as it brought pain. Hearing it now sent a lance of ice through her veins. "I know you're in there, my dear. This foolishness has gone on long enough. I've come to take you home." Jake glanced at Anna. Her face was as pale as marble, but her hands on the rifle were rock steady. Her knuckles were white, but she did not tremble. "There's a man with you," Thorne continued, his voice laced with contemptuous amusement. Some unwashed, dirt-scratching peasant who thinks he can steal what is mine. Send him out, Anna, and I may yet be merciful. I will kill him, of course, but I will make it quick. He paused, letting his words sink in. If you make me come in there for you, I will make him suffer. And then, my dear, then I will remind you of the cost of disobedience. Anna took a deep, shuddering breath. She looked at Jake, her eyes filled with a love and a resolve that was as strong as tempered steel. Over my dead body, she whispered, not to Thorn, but to Jake. Jake gave a grim, tight-lipped smile. He raised his Winchester, resting the barrel on the windowsill, and took careful aim at a spot in the dirt just in front of Thorn's horse. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot shattered the morning stillness. A puff of dust erupted in front of the black stallion, causing it to rear up, startled. The message was clear, unequivocal, and written in a language that every man there understood. There would be no negotiation. There would be no surrender. The gathering storm had finally broken. Chapter 7. The Devil at the Door. Jake's rifle shot was a declaration of war. The sound, sharp and definitive, echoed across the plains, a single, defiant note against the symphony of menace that surrounded them. Marcus Thorn, a skilled horseman, quickly brought his spooked stallion under control, but a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by fury, crossed his handsome face. He had expected a cowering woman and a terrified farmer. He had not expected this. He had not expected an immediate, unambiguous challenge. He stared at the small, silent cabin, a muscle working in his jaw. The sheer audacity of the resistance was an insult to his very being. He was Marcus Thorn. Men scrambled to do his bidding. Women dreamed of his favor. The world bent to his will. The idea that this peasant and this damaged and grateful woman would dare to defy him was an intolerable affront. So be it, he said, his voice no longer smooth and cultured, but a low, vicious snarl that was audible even at a distance. He wheeled his horse around and rode back to his men. No mercy, they heard him command. I want him dead. I want her alive. Burn them out if you have to. The 8 men dismounted, spreading out, using the sparse cover of rocks and the gentle roll of the land to their advantage. They were not common thugs. They moved with a practiced, military precision. Thorn had not just brought hired muscle, he had brought killers. They're splitting up, Jake said, his voice low and calm, his eyes tracking the movement. To heading for the barn. For coming straight on. The other 2 are circling wide, trying to get to the back. Anna, you take the ones on the right. I'll take the left. Don't fire until they're in the open. Make every shot count. Anna nodded, her mouth dry, her heart a trip hammer against her ribs. This was it. The abstract horror of the last few weeks had coalesced into this single, terrifying moment. Men with guns were coming to kill the man she loved and to drag her back to a living hell. She rested her cheek against the cool wood of the rifle stock, the scent of gun oil and worn leather filling her nostrils. She looked down the long barrel, lining up the sights, just as Jake had taught her. The world narrowed to that small, deadly aperture. There was no past, no future, only this. The first shots came from Thorn's men, a ragged volley that thudded into the thick wooden walls of the cabin, sending splinters flying. It was covering fire, meant to keep their heads down while the others advanced. Jake and Anna held their position, not returning fire, their patience a weapon in itself. Steady, Jake murmured, his voice a calm anchor in the storm of noise. Wait for it. 2 of the men broke cover, making a dash for the front of the house. They were fast, running low to the ground. Now, Jake commanded. 2 rifles cracked almost as one. One of the advancing men cried out, clutching his leg as he tumbled to the ground. The other one dove for the cover of a shallow ditch, bullets kicking up dust around him. The man on the ground tried to crawl after his companion, but Jake's second shot was swift and final. It struck the man in the chest, and he went still. A wave of nausea washed over Anna. A man was dead, a life extinguished because of her. But the cold, hard logic of survival pushed the feeling down. It was him or Jake. It was him or her. There was no other choice. One down, Jake said, his voice grim. Reload. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The firefight became a deadly dance of movement and suppression. Thorn's men were professionals. They laid down a withering field of fire, bullets chewing at the window frames, ricocheting off the stone hearth. Inside, Jake and Anna moved from window to window, using their barricades for cover, firing sparingly, effectively. They were a well-oiled machine, their movements synchronized by unspoken understanding. The two men who had gone to the barn were now using it for cover, firing at the side of the house. It was a smart move, creating a crossfire. "I'm pinned down here," Jake called out. "Anna, can you get an angle on the barn?" Anna crawled across the floor to the small window on the side of the cabin. She cautiously peeked out. She could see one of the men, partially hidden behind a water trough. It was a difficult shot. She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The man at the trough grunted, dropping his gun and staggering back, his hand pressed to his shoulder. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. His companion dragged him back behind the relative safety of the barn wall. A wild, fierce exhilaration surged through Anna. She had done it. She had defended their home. She had defended him. She was not helpless. But their small victory was short-lived. A new, more immediate threat emerged. From the back of the house, there was a sudden, splintering crash. The two men who had circled around had reached the back door. They were using a heavy log as a battering ram. "The back door," Anna cried. Jake cursed, grabbing the heavy iron beam they had prepared and shoving it into place, bracing the door. But the wood was old, and the blows were powerful and rhythmic. The door frame was beginning to splinter. It wouldn't hold for long. "We have to fall back," Jake said, his mind racing. "Get to the trench. Now." He laid down a volley of covering fire from the front window while Anna scrambled towards the small, concealed trapdoor in the floor that led to a shallow root cellar. It was their only escape route. She threw it open, the smell of damp earth rising to meet her. The back door groaned, the wood shrieking in protest. It was about to give way. "Go," Jake yelled, firing his last shot before turning and diving for the trapdoor just as the back door burst inwards in a shower of splintered wood. They tumbled into the cramped, dark space of the cellar, pulling the trapdoor shut above them just as heavy boots thudded on the floorboards. They could hear the men shouting, the sounds terrifyingly close. They held their breath, crammed together in the darkness, the smell of earth and fear thick around them. The root cellar was small, but a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, led from it to the trench Jake had dug at the back of the property. It was a desperate gamble, an escape route he had dug years ago in case of a prairie fire. He had never imagined he would use it like this. He pushed Anna towards the tunnel. "Crawl," he whispered. "Don't stop until you feel the open air." The tunnel was claustrophobic and dark, the rough earth scraping at her hands and knees. She could hear Jake crawling behind her, his breathing heavy. Above them, they heard more shouting, and then a new, terrifying sound, the crackle of fire. "They're burning the house," Jake said, his voice grim in the darkness. A primal scream of despair rose in Anna's throat, but she choked it down. The house, their home, the only place she had ever felt safe. She pushed the thought away. They had to survive. They emerged, gasping, into the relative safety of the trench, blinking in the bright morning light. Thick, black smoke was billowing from the windows of the cabin. Their home was an inferno. The sight was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. But there was no time for grief. Thorne's men were fanning out from the burning house, expecting them to be fleshed out. Jake and Anna crouched low in the trench, which offered excellent cover and a clear line of sight. The fight was not over. It had just moved to a new battlefield. From his position a safe distance away, Marcus Thorne watched the cabin burn, a cruel, satisfied smile on his face. He assumed the fight was won. He had underestimated them once, but he would not do so again. He expected to see them running from the flames, choking and terrified, ready to beg for mercy. Instead, two rifles barked from the trench. One of the men advancing from the house cried out and fell. Another staggered, hit in the arm. The remaining men dove for cover, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. This was impossible. They were like ghosts, refusing to die. He spurred his horse forward, his rage overriding his caution. "Useless fools," he roared at his men. "They're in the ditch. Root them out. I want them now." The battle now became a desperate, deadly siege of the trench. Bullets zipped overhead, thudding into the earthen embankment. Jake and Anna were pinned down, but their position was a strong one. They were fighting back to back, a small, desperate island of resistance against a tide of violence. One of Thorne's men, a big, burly man with a thick beard, decided to end it. With a roar, he charged the trench, firing his pistol wildly. "He's mine," Jake said, his voice a low growl. He rose from the trench just enough to get a clear shot. He fired. The big man grunted, a look of surprise on his face, before he pitched forward, falling just a few feet from the edge of their position. But in that moment of exposure, another of Thorne's men, positioned on a small rise, took his shot. Jake cried out a sharp, ragged sound of pain, and fell back into the trench, his hand clutching his side. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across his shirt. "Jake!" Anna screamed, her heart stopping. She scrambled to his side, her mind a blank slate of terror. The world outside the trench, the gunfire, the shouting, faded away. There was only Jake, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his teeth gritted in pain. It's not bad," he gasped, though his face told a different story. "Just grazed me. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. The wound was bleeding freely. He was losing blood, and his strength was fading. Anna looked at him, at the man who had promised to die for her, and a cold, hard fury unlike anything she had ever known rose up within her. It was a rage that burned away her fear, her grief, her despair. Marcus Thorne had done this. He had burned their home. He had shot the man she loved. He had taken everything. But he had not taken her wool. She tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat and pressed it hard against Jake's wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. "Stay with me, Jake," she commanded, her voice fierce. "Stay with me." She then picked up her rifle, her movements precise and deadly. She peeked over the edge of the trench. Thorne's men were advancing again, more cautiously now, using the terrain for cover. There were 4 of them left, plus Thorne himself. She was outnumbered. Her partner was wounded. Her home was a smoking ruin. But she was not broken. She was a survivor. And the devil was at her door. And she was going to send him back to hell. Chapter 8, Fire and Fury. The world had shrunk to the narrow, dusty confines of the trench. The sun climbed higher, beating down with a merciless intensity, mirroring the fire that had consumed their home and the fury that now burned in Anna's soul. The smell of smoke and gunpowder was thick in the air, a choking, acrid perfume of battle. Jake was slumped against the earthen wall, his face pale, his breathing shallow. The makeshift bandage on his side was already soaked through with blood. He was fading, and she knew it. "Anna," he rasped, his hand finding hers. His grip was weak. "You have to run. Use the creek bed. Get away." "No," she said, her voice a low, fierce whisper that held no room for argument. She was reloading her rifle, her hands moving with a swift, mechanical efficiency that belied the storm of terror and rage within her. "There's no more running. Not for me. Not for you. We end this. Here. Now." She looked at him, at the lines of pain etched on his face, and a terrible, cold resolve settled over her. He had fought for her. Now, she would fight for him. She would become the fortress. She would be the shield. The firing from Thorne's men had become more sporadic. They were no longer charging recklessly. They had learned a bloody lesson about the defiance of their cornered prey. Now, they were creeping forward, a slow, patient, encircling boa constrictor, content to wait for their victims to bleed out, to bake in the sun, to lose hope. Anna knew they couldn't afford to wait. Their ammunition was dwindling. Jake's life was seeping into the dry Texas soil. She had to change the equation. She had to do something unexpected. Her eyes scanned the battlefield, the smoking ruins of the cabin, the barn, which was still miraculously untouched, and beyond it, the corral, where Jake kept a small reserve of hay for the winter. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form in her mind. Fire could be an enemy, but it could also be an ally. "Jake," she said, her voice urgent. "The barn. The hay. If I can get to it, I can create a diversion. Smoke. Confusion. It's our only chance." He tried to protest, to tell her it was suicide, but a wave of dizziness washed over him, and his words dissolved into a pained groan. He could only look at her, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for her to be safe. She gave his hand a final, firm squeeze. "I'll be back." It was the longest 50 yards of her life. Crouching low, she scrambled from the end of the trench, using the body of the man Jake had shot as a gruesome but effective shield. Bullets kicked up dust around her, one of them tearing through the sleeve of her dress, but she didn't slow. Adrenaline was afire in her veins, burning away fear, leaving only a white-hot core of purpose. She reached the relative safety of the barn's wall, her lungs heaving, her heart hammering. She risked a glance back. Jake was watching her, his Winchester propped up on the edge of the trench, providing what little covering fire he could manage. The effort was clearly costing him, but he was still in the fight. He was still fighting for her. Inside the barn, the air was cool and smelled of hay and horses. She found what she was looking for, a can of kerosene for the lanterns. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, but she forced them to be still. She drenched a pile of loose hay with the flammable liquid, then found the lucifer matches Jake kept in a tin box on a shelf. She took a deep breath. This was it. She struck a match, the small flame a tiny, defiant star in the gloom of the barn. She touched it to the kerosene-soaked hay. The result was instantaneous and explosive. The hay erupted in a whoosh of flame and thick, oily black smoke. The fire spread with terrifying speed, licking its way up the dry wooden walls of the barn, feeding on the packed hay in the loft. She didn't wait to admire her work. She ran to the far side of the barn, to a small door that opened out onto the plains, away from the main fight. She burst out into the sunlight, coughing, the smoke already thick and choking. The effect on Thorne's men was exactly what she had hoped for. Their attention, which had been focused entirely on the trench, was now divided. The side of the barn, their main source of cover on that side of the property, turning into a raging inferno, created confusion and panic. The thick, black smoke, carried by the morning breeze, began to drift across the battlefield, obscuring sightlines, turning the open plains into a confusing, shadowy landscape. This was her chance. But Marcus Thorne was not a fool. He saw her, a lone figure running from the burning barn. He realized her plan in an instant. "There she is," he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. "After her. Forget the man, get the woman." He spurred his horse, galloping to cut off her path back to the trench. Two of his men followed his lead, breaking from their cover and charging her position. Anna ran, her legs pumping, her lungs burning. The trench seemed 1,000 miles away. She could hear the thunder of hoofbeats behind her, getting closer. She was a rabbit, and the hounds were closing in. She risked a glance over her shoulder. Thorne was almost upon her, his face a mask of triumphant fury, his arm outstretched as if to pluck her from the ground. There was no time. She couldn't make it. She skidded to a halt, turning to face him, the rifle coming up to her shoulder in one smooth, practiced motion. She didn't aim for him. She aimed for the horse. She fired. The bullet struck the magnificent black stallion in the chest. The animal screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound of pain and terror, and its front legs buckled. Thorne, caught by surprise, was thrown clear, landing hard in the dirt with a grunt of pain and surprise. The two other riders, seeing their leader unhorsed, reined in, their attention momentarily diverted. It was the opening Jake had been waiting for. From the trench, his Winchester roared. He had gathered the last of his strength for this one desperate act. His shot was true. One of the riders clutched his chest and toppled from his saddle. The other rider, seeing his companion fall and his employer on the ground, lost his nerve. He wheeled his horse around and fled, galloping away across the plains, disappearing into the smoke and dust. Anna didn't hesitate. She ran towards the downed Marcus Thorne, who was struggling to his feet, dazed and furious. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. He was injured. The last of his men, seeing the tide of the battle turn so suddenly and catastrophically, also broke and ran, scrambling for his horse and following his cowardly companion. And then, there was silence. A sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the roar and crackle of the burning barn and the pained groans of Marcus Thorne. It was over. The siege was broken. Anna walked slowly, deliberately, towards the man who had haunted her nightmares, the man who had been the author of all her pain. He looked up at her, his handsome face streaked with dirt, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and pure, undiluted hatred. You bitch," he spat, trying to push himself up, but his broken leg collapsed under him. "You worthless, scarred whore. I should have killed you." Anna stood over him, the rifle held loosely at her side. She looked down at this man, this monster who had held such absolute power over her, and she felt nothing. The fear was gone. The hate was gone. There was only a vast, empty pity for this small, pathetic creature, a man whose only strength was in causing pain. "No, Marcus," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying easily in the sudden quiet. "You should have been a better man." She had him. He was at her mercy. The rifle in her hands was heavy with the promise of final, absolute vengeance. She could end it now. She could pull the trigger and erase him from the world, and no one would blame her. Jake, watching from the trench, his vision blurring, shouted her name, his voice a weak, desperate croak. "Anna, don't." She looked from Thorne's hateful face to the trench where the man she loved lay bleeding. And she made a choice. She was not a murderer. She was not like him. Her victory was not in taking his life, but in reclaiming her own. To kill him would be to let him win, to let him drag her down into the darkness with him. She turned her back on Marcus Thorne, leaving him broken and defeated in the dust, and ran to Jake's side. She fell to her knees in the trench, her hands fluttering over him, checking his wound, her mind racing. "Jake, stay with me. It's over. We won." He looked up at her, his eyes struggling to focus. A faint, pained smile touched his lips. "Knew you had it in you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. And then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he went limp in her arms. The fire of his life, which had burned so brightly, so fiercely for her, flickered and went out. Chapter 9: A Reckoning in the Dust. The silence that followed Jake's collapse was more profound and terrifying than the cacophony of the battle. The roar of the burning barn, the groans of the wounded Marcus Thorne, the whisper of the wind across the plains had all faded into a dull, distant hum. Anna's world contracted to the space of the trench, to the weight of the man in her arms, his life suddenly as fragile as a flickering candle flame. "No," she whispered, the word a choked, desperate prayer. "No, Jake. Don't you dare." Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat, but she ruthlessly beat it back. She had not survived Marcus, had not fought off his men, had not walked through fire, only to lose Jake now. She pressed her fingers to his neck, her own blood roaring in her ears. For a heart-stopping second, she felt nothing. Then, a faint, thready pulse fluttered against her fingertips. He was alive. That single, fragile fact was a spark in the overwhelming darkness. It was all she needed. The survivor, the warrior, the woman who had clawed her way back from the abyss, took over. First, the wound. She gently but firmly tore away his blood-soaked shirt. The bullet had entered his side, a ragged, ugly hole that was still sluggishly oozing blood. She had no idea how deep it was, or what damage it had done inside. But she knew one thing: she had to stop the bleeding, and she had to keep it clean. Her mind raced back to the things Jake had taught her about the land, about survival. He had once shown her a patch of yarrow growing near the creek bed, its feathery leaves a soft green against the brown earth. Good for stopping bleeding, he had told her. An old tracker's trick. Leaving Jake for a moment was a physical agony, but she had no choice. She scrambled from the trench, her eyes scanning the ground. She found the yarrow, grabbing handfuls of it, and raced back. She crushed the leaves in her hands, creating a dark green, aromatic poultice, and pressed it firmly into the wound. Then she tore another cleaner strip from her petticoat and bound it tightly around his torso, creating a pressure bandage. It was a crude, desperate piece of battlefield medicine, but it was the best she could do. Next, the immediate threat. Marcus Thorne. She looked over the edge of the trench. He had managed to drag himself a few feet, his face a grotesque mask of pain and fury. He was trying to reach the pistol one of his dead men had dropped. Anna picked up her rifle. The walk from the trench to where he lay was the walk of a queen reclaiming her kingdom. Each step was deliberate, empowered. The roles were now utterly, completely reversed. He was the one who was broken, helpless, crawling in the dirt. She was the one who held the power of life and death. He saw her coming, and a flicker of genuine fear, an emotion he was used to inspiring but not experiencing, crossed his face. He stopped reaching for the gun. "So, this is it," he sneered, trying to gather the last tattered shreds of his arrogance. "The broken little sparrow is going to kill me? It's a fittingly pathetic end." Anna stopped a few feet from him, looking down at the man who had been the central, terrifying figure of her life for so long. She saw him now not as a demon, but as he truly was, a spoiled, cruel child who destroyed things he could not possess. "I thought about it," she said, her voice calm and even. It was the voice of a stranger, someone she had only just become. "I thought about putting a bullet in your head and watching the light go out of your eyes. I thought about all the pain you caused me, all the nights I woke up screaming. And I thought about how easy it would be to just end you." She raised the rifle, aiming it squarely at his chest. His eyes widened. For the first time, he truly believed she would do it. "But then I looked at Jake," she continued, her voice dropping, becoming more intense. "The man lying over there, bleeding for me. A man who showed me what kindness and honor look like. A man who saw my scars and didn't see ugliness, but strength. And I realized something. Killing you wouldn't erase what you did. It would just make me like you. It would make me a creature of violence and hate." She lowered the rifle. "My revenge, Marcus, is not your death. My revenge is my life. It's the fact that I survived you. It's the fact that I'm going to live, and love, and be happy, while you are left with nothing but your own pathetic, empty soul." She looked at the scars on her own arm, the ones she used to hide in shame. "You told me these scars were your mark of ownership. You were wrong. They are my brand. They are the mark of a woman who was burned but refused to be consumed, who was cut but refused to bleed out, who was broken but refused to stay shattered. And you will have no part in the chapters to come." With a final, dismissive glance, she turned her back on him. It was the ultimate act of power, of liberation. She was not just walking away from him, she was walking away from the fear, the shame, the victimhood he had chained her to. She was walking towards her future. Her first priority was Jake. He was a dead weight, and she struggled to get him out of the trench. Adrenaline gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She half dragged, half carried him away from the burning barn and the smoking ruins of the cabin, finding a spot of shade under the lone cottonwood tree by the creek bed. He needed water. He needed a doctor. Redemption was a day's ride away, and the sheriff was a coward. There was no help to be found there. She was on her own. She found Jake's canteen, which was still half full, and gently moistened his lips. His eyelids fluttered. "Anna," he whispered. "I'm here, Jake," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm right here. You're going to be okay." She looked at his horse, Buck, who was standing nervously near the corral, having survived the firefight. Then she looked at the bodies of Thorne's men, littering the ground. An idea, grim but necessary, took hold. She systematically, dispassionately, went through the pockets of the dead men. She found a few coins, a pocket knife, and, most importantly, several full canteens of water and a small flask of whiskey. From their saddles, she took blankets and ammunition. She was no longer squeamish. This was about survival. Her final task was the most difficult. She couldn't leave Marcus Thorne there. To leave him was to risk him finding a way to come after them again. But she would not be his executioner. She found him where she had left him, slumped against a rock, his face pale with pain and blood loss. She walked up to him, carrying a length of rope she had taken from one of the saddles. "What now?" he rasped, his voice weak. "Going to tie me up and torture me? It would be a new experience for you, I'm sure." "No," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. She found his horse, which had wandered nearby, and with great effort, managed to get it to its feet. Then she tied Marcus's hands securely in front of him. It took all her strength, but she managed to haul him into the saddle, his broken leg causing him to cry out in agony. She tied his feet together under the horse's belly. She took the reins and led the horse a short distance away from the ranch, pointing it in the direction of redemption. "The horse knows the way to town," she said. "If you're lucky, someone will find you before you bleed out or die of thirst. You can tell the sheriff whatever story you want. Tell him you were attacked by outlaws. It doesn't matter. No one will believe a story about a lone woman and a wounded man defeating 8 hired guns." She looked up at him one last time, this man who was now utterly defeated, a prisoner on his own horse. "Don't ever come back," she said, her voice as hard as steel. "If I ever see your face again, I will not hesitate. I will put a bullet between your eyes. That is a promise." She slapped the horse's rump, and it trotted off, carrying its wretched cargo away from her life forever. The reckoning was over. Now, the fight for Jake's life began. She knew he couldn't survive a ride to redemption. She had to treat him here. She half carried, half dragged him into the cool, dark space of the root cellar, the only part of their home that remained. She made him as comfortable as she could with the blankets she had salvaged. Using the whiskey as an antiseptic, she cleaned his wound as best she could. He cried out in his delirium, but she held him steady, her voice a low, soothing murmur. The bullet was still in there, she was sure of it. She had no way to get it out. All she could do was keep the wound clean, give him water, and pray. For the next 3 days, she was his nurse, his guardian, his anchor to the living world. She barely slept, dozing in brief, fitful bursts, her hand always on his forehead or holding his. He was consumed by a raging fever, tossing and turning, muttering names and places she didn't recognize. In his delirium, he spoke of his first wife, of his father, of a cattle drive in a blizzard. And he spoke her name over and over, sometimes a cry of fear, sometimes a whisper of love. She fought the fever with cold compresses, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. She talked to him constantly, telling him about her day, about the hawk she saw circling overhead, about her plans to rebuild the cabin. She talked to keep him tethered to her, to give his spirit a voice to follow back from the shadowy valley he was wandering in. On the 4th day, the fever broke. She awoke from a light doze to find him looking at her, his eyes clear and lucid for the first time. His face was gone, his skin pale, but he was himself. "Hey," he whispered, his voice a dry, scratchy rasp. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her. "Hey, yourself," she said, her voice choked with tears. He looked around the small, dark cellar, then his eyes found hers again. "We did it," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Yes, Jake," she whispered, her hand closing over his. "We did." The dust had settled. The battle was won. The reckoning was complete. They had lost their home, but they had won their lives, and their future. Battered, bruised, and scarred, they had survived. And in the quiet, earthy darkness of the root cellar, a new day was dawning. Chapter 10. The Scars of Dawn. The days that followed the breaking of the fever were quiet and slow, measured by the rhythm of Jake's healing. The root cellar became their entire world, a temporary womb of safety and recovery. Anna ventured out only to fetch water from the creek and to salvage what little she could from the wreckage of their lives. The cabin was a blackened, skeletal ruin, a monument to the violence they had endured. The barn was a heap of charred timbers and ash. The sight was a constant, dull ache in her chest, but it was a pain tempered by a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. They were alive. Jake's recovery was a testament to his own stubborn and yielding strength. He was a terrible patient, frustrated by his weakness, impatient to be up and working. But he submitted to Anna's care with a quiet, gruff gratitude that was more eloquent than any words. She fed him broth she made from a jackrabbit she managed to shoot, cleaned and dressed his wound with a gentle, practiced touch, and sat with him for hours, her presence a silent, comforting balm. In the long, quiet hours in the cellar, they talked. They talked more than they ever had before. The barriers of silence and old pain had been burned away in the firefight, leaving behind a raw, honest intimacy. He told her more about the wife who had left, not with bitterness, but with a sad understanding. She had been a bird, he said, and he had tried to keep her in a cage made of dust and solitude. Anna, in turn, told him more about her mother, about her dreams of opening her own dress shop, small, simple dreams that Marcus had twisted into a nightmare. They were mapping the landscapes of their souls, discovering the hidden springs and barren patches, the old scars and the new, fertile ground. They were two broken halves who, in the crucible of shared trauma, were becoming something new, something whole. One afternoon, about a week after the fight, Jake, with Anna's help, managed to hobble out of the cellar and into the sunlight. He leaned heavily on her, his arm around her shoulders, and for a long moment, he just stood there, looking at the devastation. His face was grim, but there was no despair in his eyes. "Well," he said, his voice still weak but steady, "gonna be a hell of a lot of work to do." It was the most hopeful thing Anna had ever heard. He wasn't talking about leaving, about giving up. He was talking about rebuilding. He was talking about a future. Their first visitor arrived a few days later. It was Hemlock, the old blacksmith from Redemption, riding a mule and leading another packed with supplies. He dismounted, his craggy face unreadable, and looked from the burned-out cabin to Jake, who was sitting on a salvage crate, to Anna, who stood beside him, her rifle never far from her hand. "Heard there was some trouble out this way," Hemlock said, his voice a rusty grumble. "You could say that," Jake replied. Hemlock grunted. He began to unload the mule. There was flour, coffee, salt pork, bandages, and a bottle of what was likely very potent whiskey. "The whole town's talkin'," he said, not looking at them. Thorne rode in, half dead, been in some wild yarn about being ambushed by a dozen outlaws. Said they kidnapped his woman. Sheriff Brody, damn fool. He believed him. Formed a posse. Anna's heart went cold. A posse. Hemlock allowed himself a small, grim smile. Yep. Rode out with 10 men. They came back 2 days later, empty-handed and spooked. Said the land out here was haunted. They found a few bodies, pecked clean by the buzzards, and a whole lot of tracks that told a different story than the one Thorne was sellin'. A story about 2 people holding off an army. He finally looked at them, a flicker of deep, grudging respect in his old eyes. Brody ain't so brave now. And Thorne, he took the first eastbound stage out of town. Don't think he'll be back. The relief was so profound it made Anna feel dizzy. It was truly over. The shadow was gone. Hemlock stayed for an hour, sharing a cup of their new coffee, and before he left, he pressed 2 heavy boxes into Jake's hands. "From my own stock," he grumbled. "Figured you might be running low." It was ammunition. A gift from the only friend they had in the world. Hemlock's visit marked a turning point. It was a sign that the world, which had seemed so hostile, was beginning to right itself. They were no longer outcasts. They were survivors. Legends, even, in their own small, dusty corner of the world. As Jake grew stronger, the work of rebuilding began. It was back-breaking, soul-testing work. They cleared the rubble of the cabin, salvaging any timbers that could be reused. They planned a new house, not just a copy of the old one, but something better, with bigger windows to let in the light and a porch that faced the sunset. They worked together, side by side, from dawn till dusk. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, a partnership that was as solid and dependable as the earth beneath their feet. He was the brawn, the architect, the man who knew how to notch a log and set a foundation stone. She was the heart, the planner, the one who thought of where to put the garden, how to arrange the kitchen for maximum efficiency, how to turn a rough shelter into a real home. One evening, they were sitting on the foundation of their new house, watching the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The air was cool and clean, and the world was quiet. Jake reached out and gently traced the line of the most prominent scar on her cheek, the one that ran from her temple to her jaw. His touch, which had once been hesitant, was now familiar, tender, a language all its own. "Does it still hurt?" he asked, his voice low. Anna thought for a moment. She thought of the searing pain of the brand, the years of shame, the constant need to hide. And she realized, with a sense of profound, quiet wonder, that it didn't. The physical scar was there, a permanent part of her, but the wound beneath it, the one on her soul, had finally, truly healed. "No," she said, her voice soft but sure. "It's just a part of me now. It's a reminder." "A reminder of him?" Jake asked, a flicker of the old anger in his eyes. "No," she said, turning to face him, her eyes shining in the twilight. "It's a reminder of you. It's a reminder that scars don't have to be about the hurt. They can be about the healing. They can be about the person who teaches you how to survive." She leaned in and kissed him, a slow, gentle kiss filled with the quiet certainty of a shared future. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and dust and hard-won peace. They finished the house before the first snow fell, a small, sturdy cabin that was more of a home than any place either of them had ever known. It was built not just of wood and stone, but of resilience, courage, and a love that had been forged in fire. Life on the ranch settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The ghosts of the past were laid to rest, their power gone. Anna never again wore a shawl to hide her face. Her scars were a part of her story, and she wore them with a quiet dignity, a testament to the battles she had fought and won. She was not the woman who had whispered, "I'm not pure." That woman was a ghost, left behind in the ashes of the old cabin. She was Anna, a rancher, a partner, a survivor. She was a woman who had found her home not in a place, but in the steadfast heart of a good, quiet man. And as they stood on their porch, watching the vast, star-dusted blanket of the Texas night descend, they knew they were not without scars. They were both scarred, inside and out. But in the pale, beautiful light of the new dawn, their scars were not symbols of what had been taken from them, but of everything they had fought, and bled, and survived to build, together. They were not pure. They were whole. And in the wild and tamed heart of the West, that was more than enough.